Greetings. Bob Fowler here, introducing session number 5 of 5 that we are doing on the Gospel of John. I'm calling it John, Gospel of Radical Difference. The first gospel written in the New Testament, that would be Mark. We think Mark was the earliest, and we think John was the last. And there's a lot of development in between, and the relationship between the Gospels keeps scholars busy, pondering what the possibilities might be. And there's any number of theories available. Most people, I dare say, think of John's Gospel as completely separate and apart from the others, as in particular, separate and apart from Mark, but I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. But for sure, storytelling practice does continue, and there are developments in the way the stories are told. And I want to highlight a bunch of those developments. We're going to look first at John briefly, then go to Mark, and look at just a few tidbits from Mark, and then go back to John and finish up the unpacking. After Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley to a place where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas brought a detachment of soldiers together with police from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Quite an arresting crew has been sent out to take Jesus into custody. Then Jesus, knowing all that was to happen to him, that's a very Johannine touch. He knows all, always and forever. Jesus, knowing all that was to happen to him, came forward and asked them, "Whom are you looking for?" They answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus replied, "Ego eimi, I am." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. So Judas is not with the disciples, he's with the arresting party. When Jesus said to them, "Ego eimi, I am," they stepped back and fell to the ground. Again, he asked them, "Whom are you looking for?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am. So if you are looking for me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken. "I did not lose a single one of them, a single one of those whom you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's slave, and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword back into its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?" Let's leap ahead. Jesus is arrested and tried, and now we're moving towards the crucifixion. Carrying the cross by himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. Carrying the cross by himself. Remember that when we go visit Mark. And now the crucifixion scene itself. Again, apologies, but we just don't have time to cover everything in multiple chapters. But this is a memorable passage here, and it's only in John's Gospel. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. Then comes the end. After this, when Jesus knew that all was now finished, he said, "In order to fulfill Scripture, I am thirsty." A jar full of sour wine was standing there, so they put a sponge full of the wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." Then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. But let's go visit Mark, the first gospel that we think was written. The Garden of Gethsemane in Mark's version of the story. Jesus leaves the 12 behind. He takes Peter, James, and John with him. A little ways further, FYI, they're all going to fall asleep, which is completely missing from John's gospel. Going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that, if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. He threw himself on the ground. In John's gospel, it's the arresting party that's going to end up on the ground after Jesus shouts, "Ego, eimi," at them a few times. He said, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, but what you want." Remember that when we get to John. Remove this cup from me. Oh, I love this. Jesus is being arrested, and one of his disciples draws a sword. Why on earth did he have a sword? One of those who stood near drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Remember that when we get to John's version of that moment. An unnamed disciple draws a sword, cuts off an ear of a slave. We're not going to look at it, but if you were to look at Luke's telling of that moment, Luke introduces the point. Luke is copying Mark and editing Mark, embellishing it, improving on Mark, I'm sure he thinks. Luke says that the ear that was cut was the right ear, not just any old ear, but the right ear. And there's a wonderful moment there. Jesus reaches out, touches the ear, the damaged ear of the slave, and heals it. You get that in no other gospel. And I love that point from Luke. All of them deserted him and fled. So we need to imagine pandemonium, chaos, confusion. The disciples are running away, helter skelter, pell mell into the darkness to save their hides. In Mark's gospel, Jesus does not carry his cross. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexandria, Alexander and Rufus. I guess we're supposed to know that guy. Maybe the first readers of Mark's gospel knew the family. Cyrene, or Cyrene, as it's sometimes pronounced, is in North Africa. So it's not local, but it's in that general part of the world. They offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. So they offer him something to drink here, and he does not take it. Remember that when we get to John. Ah, this is powerful. This is potent. We could spend a long time wrestling with this. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which is Aramaic, we think, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? It sounds like Jesus is crying out to God in God forsakenness. Yes, he is, but in his God forsakenness, he's screaming out to God, quoting scripture. That's the first verse of Psalm 22. So when you feel abandoned by God, do you call out to God, quoting scripture back to God? Uh, that would be interesting. But there's more to that. If you read through Psalm 22, which I warmly invite you to do sometime, by the time you get to the end of it, the psalmist, the whoever it is who's crying out in anguish to God in verse 1, by the time you get to the end, things have gotten better, and God and the psalmist are in tune with each other again. Things are looking up. There's hope. There's strong possibility of a positive outcome. So the first verse of Psalm 22 is not the last verse, and that's how the psalm begins, but it's not how it ends. So very, 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 very rich. And we're going to give Jesus another drink, and I can't tell whether he took it or not. I don't think he did. I can see no indication that he did take the drink. Remember that when we get to John's Gospel. And then comes the end. Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the Greek suggests he breathed out. Uh, um, he was killed. He was put to death. Remember that when we get to John. Um, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, boldly goes to Pontius Pilate and asks for the body of Jesus, which he then buries. And that's where I'm going to abandon Mark and go back to John. The Jesus of John's Gospel has supernatural knowledge of everything. He knew what was going to happen. He's playing out the script that he's fully aware of. And all this ego, me talk, all of this I am talk, we've discussed that a bit in earlier episodes of this series. I am is the formula of self-revelation practiced by both Hebrew-speaking gods and Greek-speaking gods. In Hebrew, it's one thing. In Greek, it's ego, eimi, ego, eimi. When Jesus said to them, ego, eimi, they stepped back and fell to the ground. Remember who falls to the ground in Mark? Well, in Mark, it's earlier in the garden before the arresting party shows up. And it's Jesus who falls to the ground, and he petitions God to remove the cup from him. Jesus says to Peter and John, am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me? He seems a little less, significantly less cup resistant than he was in Mark. So in Mark, he begs God to remove the cup, but he's willing to take whatever is going to come. But here he is in control, and he's going to drink the cup, the symbolic cup, as well as the literal cup down here. I told you that ego eimi, so if you're looking for me, let these people go. In Mark, the disciples scattered into the dark. They run away, pell-mell, helter-skelter. In John's gospel, it's not crystal clear, but it seems to me to be pretty strongly implied that the disciples get to depart stage left, stage right, whichever way, and they get to walk away. They are freed to go. They do not have to scramble and run off into the dark. I see no indication that that's going to happen here. And as a result, Jesus didn't lose any of them. We're not counting Judas Iscariot. We're not counting the betrayer. Yeah, he had blown it, and that's consistent in all the Gospels. Judas is the odd man out who betrayed Jesus. So got to have some sword play. Got to lose an ear. You remember in Mark it says that someone drew his sword and cut off the ear of the slave. Well, by now, we know that the someone wielding the sword was none other than Simon Peter. We didn't know that before. And yeah, Luke Luke had specified that it was the right ear. So I wonder if John picked that up from Luke's gospel. I wonder. But it's definitely Simon Peter who cuts off the right ear of Malchus. We now know the guy's name. We haven't heard that before. So there's been a lot of storytelling development to get all the way from Mark's version of the story to John's version of the story. I don't know. I don't understand. I don't get it. Why John keeps this bit here, which in one form or another is in Mark, Matthew, and Luke. It seems to me to be completely incongruous with the notion that the disciples are going to get to walk off the stage slowly, peacefully, with dignity. This seems to be quite chaotic, a great deal of upheaval. um, but this much is echoes the synoptics. This ain't nowhere to be found in the synoptics. So John goes his own way, sometimes echoing the synoptics, but expanding upon them greatly. It's Simon Peter with the sword. It's definitely now the right ear. The guy has a name, which we are told. So many differences. You'll remember this difference from Mark. Simon of Cyrene carries the cross in Mark's gospel. The implication seems to me is pretty clear in Mark that Jesus has been beaten to a bloody pulp already, thanks to Pilate and the soldiers and so on. And he was perhaps in no condition whatsoever to carry his own cross beam. It's probably the cross beam which sits on top of an upright stake. The T-shaped cross is later tradition. Probably we should think of a cross beam which is plopped up on top of an upright stake, which stays in place for multiple executions over days, weeks, months, years. It's the cross beam that goes up and comes down, goes up and comes down. So Jesus is carrying his own cross beam in this gospel because he's in control. He is the master of ceremonies here. And we've already talked a bit about this. I don't think we need to say a lot more other than There are too many Marys. My memory is, and I think I'm correct on this, that the name of the mother of Jesus is never given in John's gospel. What the heck is going on with that? It's always his mother, his mother, his mother, his mother. But in this case, oh, we are spared spared the awkwardness of yet another Mary. And Mary, his mother, and is his mother's sister named Mary, or is his mother's sister this Mary here? It's confusing. The wording is confusing, but at least we have one, two, three Marys, if not four. So anyway, Mary, 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 and then we've talked a little bit about this already. Jesus says he's thirsty not because he's thirsty. He is, after all, in total control of the circumstances and in complete, total control of his own being. He says, I am thirsty because it's in the script. He's going to fulfill scripture. So he says, I am thirsty. They put wine on a sponge and hold it up to him. He drinks it. He partakes in it twice in Mark, once for sure, and once, I think, implied. He does not drink, but in this gospel, he does for sure, emphatically. And when he has received the wine, he says, it is finished. He bows his head and he wills the giving up of his spirit. The verb there in Greek is parodidomi, to hand over, to give away. He gives up his spirit. He is in total control until the very end. So many, many moments here in John are completely different from what we get in the other Gospels, especially the first Gospel, the Gospel of Mark. This is probably the original ending of John's Gospel, the last verses of chapter 20. Jesus did many other signs, signs all the way through the Gospel of John. That's the Johannine word for miracles. He did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, but that are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. A wonderful, ringing conclusion to the story. But read on, there's another chapter. This is chapter 21, which we think, really, to be honest, is an appendix, a late add-on. The scribes did this kind of thing. That's how we get from Mark to Matthew and Luke, and that's how we get from Mark, Matthew, Mark, Matthew, Luke on to John. There's constant revision, new storytelling, embellishments added. Sometimes things dropped out, but more often is to have things added. And this is a wonderful, wonderful resurrection appearance. And I love it to death because it's so incompatible with all the other resurrection appearances. This story is about Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, encountering his disciples on the lake shore up north, the Sea of Galilee, Kinneret, Lake Tiberias. It goes by lots of names. Sea of Tiberias here. So we got Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathaniel, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, and two unnamed disciples. And that leads to bemusement and wonder, because the disciple whom Jesus loved was there apparently in the boat. But was it John, the son of Zebedee? That's the tradition. That's what tradition says. Tradition says that's the author, and he was the beloved disciple. But that was never made absolutely definitive and clear. And I've already shared in a previous episode that Fowler's theory about the beloved disciple is that it is a placeholder for you and me. It's a way for you and me to imagine ourselves into the story. Because the storyteller tells us that it's Jesus encountering the disciples on the lake shore, but the disciples didn't know it was Jesus. And still, towards the end of the episode, they still might have asked, "Who are you, sir?" But they didn't because they kind of had it figured out because he'd already fed them some from breakfast. Um, or he was in the course of feeding them some breakfast. So it's a marvelous story, and it's so poignant and so perplexing because it seems to me to presuppose that the disciples had not really gotten the message of the resurrection down in Jerusalem, 70 or 80 miles to the south. They've gone back back north to Galilee, to where it all started, and they've gone back to fishing. Where's the Great Commission? Where's going out into the world to preach the gospel? In the Gospel of Luke and Volume 2, the Acts of the Apostles, Luke has Jesus tell the disciples, stay in Jerusalem, you'll get instructions there. In Luke Acts, once the movement moves away from Galilee down south to Jerusalem, where the crucifixion happens and where resurrection is first perceived and embraced, once the story moves from Galilee to Jerusalem, it never goes back to Galilee, not in Luke Acts. But here at the in the end of John, it goes back to Galilee. That's remarkable. It's as if resurrection experience in Jerusalem didn't happen. Clearly it did. Clearly it did. But this is a kind of standalone chapter, and I have cut off and haven't considered the threefold challenge to Peter from Jesus. Peter, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And Peter says, yes, Lord, yes, Lord, yes, Lord, you know I love you. It's so the threefold denial that Peter threw at Jesus is now redeemed, rescued, made right by the threefold pledge that Peter does indeed love Jesus to bits and will feed his lambs. So this will have to do. This has been fun. This has been interesting. I hope you've gained from it. Grace and peace.